Alex Kingston stood at the threshold of his new home, taking in the sight of the house he had purchased just a few weeks prior. A wave of satisfaction washed over him as he surveyed the meticulously landscaped yard, the gentle curve of the driveway leading up to his freshly painted garage door, and the sprawling backyard that stretched out before him like a canvas. The house was large enough for his needs, not too small to feel cramped, but not so massive that it overwhelmed him. It was perfect. In fact, it was everything Alex had dreamed of in the years following the tumultuous end of his marriage. The house was tucked away in a quiet suburban neighborhood, far removed from the hustle and bustle of city life. Alex had spent most of his adult years in the heart of the city, working tirelessly in the world of finance. His days were often long, and the pressures of his career, though lucrative, took a heavy toll on his personal life. The weight of long hours, conference calls, and endless meetings had drained him, leaving little room for personal connection. He had once found solace in his work, but after his divorce, it had become evident that the intense focus on his career had come at the expense of everything else. The city had begun to feel like a cage, its bright lights and noise suffocating him. It was time to start over. After months of searching, Alex had stumbled upon the property, a sprawling single-story home situated on a peaceful cul-de-sac. The moment he saw the listing, he knew this was the place. It wasn't just the house that drew him in. It was the yard, the promise of privacy, the large pool that beckoned from behind the back fence. It felt like a sanctuary, a space where he could finally retreat from the chaos that had consumed his life for far too long. The house itself was far from extravagant, but it exuded warmth and potential. The spacious, open-plan living room had high ceilings, large windows that flooded the space with natural light, and hardwood floors that creaked with every step, reminding Alex of the comfort of old homes. The kitchen was modern, with sleek stainless steel appliances and granite countertops that glistened under the kitchen lights, but it was the backyard that truly captured his imagination. The pool was a dream come true. Alex had always wanted a pool, envisioning afternoons spent lounging by the water, reading a good book, or swimming laps to clear his mind after a long day of work. The pool was the centerpiece of the backyard, framed by carefully maintained hedges and mature trees that provided just enough shade. The sound of water trickling from the small waterfall near the edge of the pool was a constant, soothing melody, one that Alex had quickly grown fond of. He could already imagine himself lounging on a deck chair, a cold drink in hand, watching the sunlight dance on the water. The house represented a fresh start, a clean slate. He had spent years living in cramped apartments, always too close to the noise and clutter of city life. His previous homes had never felt like places of rest, but this was different. This was his sanctuary. The move had been a significant change for Alex, but it was one that felt necessary. In the aftermath of his divorce, he had found himself questioning everything. His marriage had ended after several years of strained communication, unmet expectations, and growing distance. Though the divorce was amicable, it had left a lingering sense of failure in Alex's chest. He had always prided himself on his professional success, but his personal life had fallen apart, and the guilt weighed heavily on him. It felt like a loss. Not just the end of a relationship, but the dissolution of a vision he had once held for his future. The suburban house was an escape from that reality, a place where he could redefine his life on his terms. Moving into the house had been a long time coming. After the divorce, Alex had thrown himself into his work even more intensely, throwing himself into financial analysis and project management with a fervor he hadn't known before. It wasn't that he didn't have the time or energy for a personal life. He simply had no desire to reconnect with the chaos of the past. The late-night drinks with friends and social obligations felt meaningless, hollow. He yearned for solitude, a space to heal, to think without distractions. When he'd finally received the promotion he'd worked so hard for, it felt like a turning point in his life. The bonus and raise allowed him the financial freedom to invest in a home, a place to nurture himself, to rebuild from the ground up. So, after years of living in apartments, dealing with the hustle of urban life, he sold his city condo, packed up his belongings, and relocated to the suburbs. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more inspiring stories like this. Thanks for taking the time to listen, and we hope to see you again soon. The quiet cul-de-sac was everything Alex had imagined it would be. The streets were lined with neatly kept homes, and the only sounds were the hum of lawnmowers on Saturday mornings and the occasional chirping of birds in the trees. The neighborhood was tranquil, the perfect setting for the new life Alex had envisioned. His new house was a place of serenity, a sanctuary where he could reconnect with himself and start anew. In the weeks that followed his move, Alex settled into a comfortable rhythm. He spent his mornings swimming laps in the pool, his evenings unwinding with a book on the patio, and his weekends fixing up the house, making it truly feel like his own. He quickly learned that suburban life offered a slower pace, a stark contrast to the frenetic energy of city living, and he relished it. No more late-night board meetings, no more constant emails demanding his attention. Instead, there was time to think, to reflect, to heal. The pool, in particular, had become Alex's refuge. He would often spend hours gazing at the still water, feeling the weight of his life slowly lift as he submerged himself beneath the surface. There was something magical about the way the water mirrored the sky, how it seemed to calm the noise of the world, allowing him to think clearly. The pool was the physical manifestation of the peace Alex longed for, and it was here, in this space, that he began to rebuild his life. The morning swim became a ritual, one he looked forward to every day, a small slice of calm before the demands of the world crept back in. And yet, as much as Alex relished the peace of his new home, he couldn't shake the lingering sense of being an outsider. He was new to the neighborhood, and while the residents seemed friendly enough, he didn't have the energy to engage in the typical neighborly banter. He wasn't looking for new friends. He just wanted to be left alone to heal, to rebuild his life at his own pace. The quiet was exactly what he needed. But even in his newfound peace, Alex knew that eventually the neighborhood would demand his participation. It was inevitable. Neighbors waved as they walked by, people came over for brief chats, and even the smallest gestures of connection started to pull Alex out of his cocoon of solitude. He wasn't sure if he was ready for it, but it was clear that the life he had envisioned, a life of complete isolation, might not be as simple as he had hoped. For now, though, Alex enjoyed the quiet. He sat by the pool, gazing out at the gently rippling water, and allowed himself a moment of calm before the inevitable demands of life crept in. In this moment, he was content. This house was his, the pool was his, and for the first time in a long while, he felt like he was exactly where he needed to be. Alex Kingston's new life in the quiet suburban neighborhood had started off as a peaceful escape, but as he spent more time in his new home, it became clear that his solitude would be short-lived. The sound of distant lawnmowers and chirping birds might have seemed like the perfect soundtrack to his days of rest, but the reality of suburban life wasn't quite as silent as he had hoped. It wasn't just the occasional rustle of neighbors coming and going, or the familiar hum of families settling into their own routines. There were moments when the social pressure of engaging with others crept in, something Alex wasn't entirely prepared for. He had always been a solitary man, content in his own company, preferring quiet evenings by the pool to crowded parties or large gatherings. But living in a neighborhood meant that he would have to face that inevitable awkwardness of neighborly interactions. His new home might have been his sanctuary, but it wasn't without its own set of social dynamics. The first knock on his door came a week after he'd moved in. It was a sunny Saturday afternoon when Alex was relaxing on his patio, sipping iced tea and enjoying the view of the shimmering pool. The doorbell rang sharply through the quiet, breaking the stillness of his solitude. Alex wasn't expecting anyone, and he wasn't exactly eager to welcome visitors, but out of politeness he reluctantly stood up and made his way to the front door. When he opened it, he was greeted by a smiling couple in their late 40s. The man was tall, with salt and pepper hair and a warm, open smile that made Alex feel both relieved and uncomfortable at the same time. The woman, who stood beside him, was smaller, her smile just as friendly, but her energy slightly more reserved. They introduced themselves as Tom and Linda Harris, the couple who lived 2 doors down from Alex's house. "We just wanted to stop by and introduce ourselves," Tom said, his voice boisterous and friendly, instantly setting Alex at ease. "We've seen you around, but haven't had a chance to meet yet." Alex forced a smile, not quite sure how to react. He had hoped for some quiet, uninterrupted time to settle in, but he could tell that a welcome from the neighbors was part of the package deal when moving into a suburban community. "Well, it's nice to meet you both," Alex said, still standing at the doorframe. "I've been meaning to take a walk around the block to meet everyone, just getting settled in." Tom laughed, a deep and hearty sound that echoed in the quiet street. "Well, you've already made a great choice in choosing this place. It's quiet, peaceful. You'll love it here." Linda, who had remained more subdued, stepped forward and extended a hand. "If you ever need anything, don't hesitate to ask. We're just next door. And our kids, well, they're grown now, but we're always around if you need a hand with anything." The exchange was polite enough, but as Alex shook Linda's hand, he felt a slight unease creeping into his chest. The warmth was genuine, but there was something about it that seemed a little too eager. After all, Alex wasn't looking for new friendships. His priority was the space to heal, to figure out what came next for him. The idea of becoming a part of the social fabric of this neighborhood wasn't exactly appealing. "Thanks, I appreciate that," Alex replied, his voice as neutral as he could make it. The conversation drifted to the local community, and Tom eagerly described the regular neighborhood events: potlucks, barbecues, and the occasional block party. It sounded nice in theory, but Alex couldn't help but feel a sense of discomfort at the thought of participating. He wasn't averse to socializing, but he wasn't used to being so visible either. The thought of having to attend one of those block parties felt like another reminder of the things he wanted to leave behind. "Well, I'll leave you to get settled," Tom said, giving Alex a final, friendly clap on the shoulder before they both turned and walked away. "But if you need anything, you know where we are." Alex stood in the doorway for a moment, watching them leave. It was a nice gesture, no doubt, but the whole interaction had been a little too much for his taste. He wasn't prepared to be welcomed so warmly into a community, at least not yet. He hadn't quite figured out where he fit into this neighborhood, and the idea of opening himself up to new people felt overwhelming. The next few days brought more of the same. As Alex spent his afternoons by the pool or in the quiet of his living room, he found himself encountering more neighbors, some on their walks, others tending to their yards. He would exchange polite nods and brief greetings, but deep down, Alex felt like he was constantly on the edge of something he didn't want to be a part of. But it wasn't just the Harris family that made Alex feel uneasy. It was the Jenkins family next door that truly set him on edge. The Jenkins were a whirlwind of activity, a contrast to the calm and laid-back nature of the other families. They were the kind of neighbors that couldn't help but make their presence known, whether they were hosting a loud barbecue or chasing their kids around the yard. Alex first met the Jenkins one evening when he was out for a walk, trying to get some fresh air after a long day of work. He had been walking down the sidewalk when he heard laughter and the unmistakable sound of basketballs bouncing on concrete. Looking over, he saw a tall man, Paul Jenkins, shooting hoops with his two teenage sons. Their energetic banter echoed down the street, filling the air with a constant hum of noise Alex hadn't minded at first. After all, it was just a game, and kids needed their space to have fun. But it wasn't just the basketball game that caught his attention. When Alex turned the corner, he saw Paul's wife, Sarah, sitting outside on the porch, chatting loudly on the phone. Her voice carried over to Alex, making him feel like an outsider. It wasn't that Sarah was rude, she was just loud. Her conversations were animated, and she spoke with such energy that Alex could almost feel the words vibrating in the air. He nodded politely as he passed, but he couldn't help but feel like the Jenkins family was a little too present for his liking. They had that kind of energy that was both warm and overwhelming, as if they were constantly inviting you into their world, whether you wanted to be there or not. A few days later, when Alex was enjoying a quiet evening by the pool, he heard the Jenkins car pull up in their driveway. The whole family spilled out: Paul, Sarah, their two teenage boys, and even their daughter, who was a bit younger. They were laughing loudly and making their way into the house, the noise of their conversation drifting through the fence and into Alex's backyard. It wasn't that he disliked them. Paul was friendly enough, with a booming laugh and an easy smile, But there was something about the Jenkins family's constant activity, their openness, that unsettled Alex. They seemed to thrive on being seen and heard, and that wasn't something Alex was accustomed to. He had always prided himself on the ability to remain out of the spotlight, to blend into the background, and the Jenkins didn't seem to understand the need for space. Despite his discomfort, Alex continued to make polite small talk whenever he ran into Paul or Sarah, but he couldn't shake the feeling that their larger-than-life personalities were an intrusion on his quiet existence. And it wasn't just the Jenkins family that seemed to want to draw him out. It was the whole neighborhood. Everyone seemed so eager to know him, to include him in their gathering, and while it was a kindness, Alex was beginning to wonder if he had made the right decision in moving here. His new house had been his sanctuary, a retreat from the chaos of his previous life. But now, as he looked out at the Jenkins house next door, he wondered if he had unwittingly walked into a community that was too close for comfort. As much as he appreciated the warm gestures and friendly smiles, Alex couldn't shake the feeling that he was being pulled into something he wasn't ready for. Alex Kingston had thought that moving to the quiet suburban neighborhood would allow him the peace and privacy he so desperately needed after the chaos of his previous life. The house, with its large backyard and private pool, had been a sanctuary, a place to escape the demands of work and the emotional weight of his past. But over time, that sanctuary started to feel less like a retreat and more like a battleground for his boundaries. It started innocently enough. Alex had noticed the Jenkins kids, Jake, the oldest, and Emma, his younger sister, playing in their own backyard. It was typical neighborhood noise, basketballs bouncing, laughter echoing between the fences. At first, Alex didn't mind it. He had grown up in a loud family after all. But when he heard a few days later that the Jenkins kids were playing near his pool fence, he thought nothing of it. Kids liked to roam and explore. It wasn't unusual for them to wander close to the neighbors' yards. But then came the first incident that made him realize things weren't as harmless as they seemed. It was a Saturday afternoon when Alex returned from a quick run to the store. He was looking forward to some downtime, perhaps a swim to cool off from the heat. As he rounded the corner of his house toward the backyard, he froze. The unmistakable sound of splashing water reached his ears, and as he stepped onto the patio, he could see the figure of a young boy in the pool. He squinted to get a better look, and to his disbelief, it was Jake Jenkins, one of his next-door neighbors. The boy was laughing, along with two other friends Alex didn't recognize, all of them happily splashing around in his pool. Alex's heart rate quickened. His first instinct was to assume it was some sort of mistake. Maybe the kids were just playing nearby and had accidentally wandered in. But the fact that Jake was smiling, completely unaware of the situation, told him everything he needed to know. This wasn't a mistake. The kids knew exactly what they were doing. Without thinking, Alex strode toward the gate that separated their yards and called out, his voice firm but controlled. "Hey! What's going on here?" The kids froze immediately, their laughter dying down as they turned to face him. For a moment, there was an uncomfortable silence as they looked at each other, perhaps wondering how to respond. "What are you doing in my pool?" Alex repeated, this time more forcefully. He had made it clear when he moved in that his property was private, especially the pool area. The neighborhood was peaceful, but it didn't seem like they understood the concept of boundaries. Jake, his cheeks flushed with embarrassment, stammered, "We were just swimming. We didn't think, sorry, man." Alex took a deep breath, trying to remain calm. "You didn't think? It's my property. I didn't give anyone permission to use it. You need to get out, now." The other kids mumbled apologies as they quickly scrambled to grab their towels, embarrassed and uncomfortable. As they disappeared through the side gate, Alex stood there for a moment, staring at the empty pool. His frustration was rising, but he tried to remind himself that this was a simple misunderstanding, one that could be easily fixed with a clear conversation. Or so he thought. Later that evening, Alex decided to stop by the Jenkins house. He was disappointed, but he knew he needed to address the situation directly with Paul and Sarah Jenkins. They needed to understand that there were clear boundaries when it came to his property. When Paul answered the door, Alex immediately launched into his explanation. "Your kids were in my pool today, without permission. I don't know if they didn't understand the boundaries, but it's not acceptable." Paul's response was a shrug, a wide grin on his face. Kids being kids, right? They don't always think things through. Don't worry, I'll talk to them. It won't happen again." Alex wasn't sure how to respond to Paul's nonchalant attitude. There was a part of him that appreciated Paul's lightheartedness. He seemed like a good-natured guy after all. But there was also something dismissive in the way he treated the issue. The casual dismissal of his concerns made Alex feel as though his boundaries didn't matter, as if he were overreacting. It was the same attitude that had been creeping into his thoughts ever since he'd moved in. The feeling that his request for privacy was somehow an inconvenience to others. He nodded stiffly, trying not to let his frustration show. Just, "Please make sure it doesn't happen again. I'm not comfortable with people using my property without asking." Paul chuckled, slapping Alex lightly on the back. "Of course, we'll sort it out, no problem." But Alex wasn't convinced. He had a nagging feeling that this wouldn't be the end of it. Over the next few days, Alex tried to shake off the lingering tension. He resumed his routine: work, a swim in the pool, and a quiet evening spent reading or watching TV. But the unease never quite left him. He couldn't shake the thought that something was off, that perhaps this wasn't a simple misunderstanding, but a sign of things to come. His suspicions proved to be correct. A week later, he came home to find the Jenkins kids in his pool again. This time, the scene was even more blatant. Not only were Jake and Emma in the pool, but there were several other teenagers with them, all splashing and laughing like it was a public park. They had set up a cooler on the patio, and someone had even plugged in a portable speaker, the blaring music cutting through the air. Alex stood frozen for a moment, disbelief washing over him. How could they not get it? He had been clear in his request, yet here they were again, treating his property like an extension of their own. This time, there was no hesitation in Alex's movements. He marched directly toward the gate, his voice cold as he called out, "Hey, I've asked you not to do this. Get out of my pool, now." The kids froze, their faces going pale as they realized who was speaking. Jake, looking embarrassed once again, muttered something about not realizing it was a problem. But this time, Alex wasn't in the mood to let them off easily. "No more excuses. This is private property. I don't want anyone in my pool again without permission. Is that clear?" Jake and his friends quickly gathered their belongings, muttering apologies as they made their way to the gate. Alex watched them leave, his hands clenched at his sides. This was starting to feel like a battle, not just with the kids, but with the very fabric of the neighborhood itself. The following morning, Alex decided it was time to take a more proactive approach. He wrote a note, a clear, polite, but firm reminder that his pool was off limits to anyone without permission. He dropped the note into the Jenkins mailbox and hoped that would be the end of it. For a few days there was silence. The Jenkins kids stayed away from his yard, and Alex felt a brief sense of relief. Maybe, just maybe, his firm stance had worked. But the calm didn't last. The next weekend he was woken by the sound of laughter and the unmistakable noise of splashing water. As he groggily stepped outside to check, he saw Jake and his friends, this time with even more kids, once again in the pool. His blood ran cold. It was becoming clear that this wasn't just about misunderstandings or playful kids being too curious. It was about a fundamental disregard for his boundaries. And the more it happened, the more Alex realized he couldn't let it slide anymore. Something had to change. He had to find a way to make it clear that his space was not for others to invade. At that moment, standing at the edge of his pool, Alex felt a surge of frustration. The peace he had once found here seemed to be slipping away. His sanctuary was under siege, and the worst part was that it felt like no one was listening. Alex Kingston had been patient. He had tried to be polite, to explain to the Jenkins family, and even to the kids themselves, that his pool was private property and off limits. He had spoken with Paul and Sarah Jenkins, asking them to talk to their children and put an end to the constant invasions of his space. Despite his efforts, the situation had only worsened. The kids continued to use his pool without permission. showing no regard for his boundary. Their behavior had grown more brazen, and Alex felt increasingly disrespected and powerless in his own home. The peaceful refuge he had hoped for had turned into a battleground for his privacy. Each day that passed, Alex's frustration grew. He wasn't the type to act impulsively, but when polite requests and calm conversations had failed, he realized that the only way to get through to the Jenkins family, and the neighborhood as a whole, was to take action. He had to show them in no uncertain terms that his space was sacred, that his boundaries were non-negotiable. Alex was tired of being the nice guy, of trying to appease others while they trampled over his needs. After another sleepless night thinking about how to handle the situation, an idea began to take shape in his mind. It wasn't an ideal solution, but it was the only one that might have the desired effect. Alex knew that the Jenkins family and their friends didn't take him seriously when he said no. They thought he was being overly protective, maybe even a little unreasonable. But what if he could create a scenario that would make it impossible for them to ignore? A scene so unsettling that no one would want to come near his pool again. The plan wasn't something Alex came to lightly. He had considered various options. Talking to the neighborhood homeowners association, calling the authorities, even putting up a fence, but none of those ideas felt like they would send the clear message he needed. He wanted something immediate, something dramatic, something that would be impossible to overlook. His thoughts turned to the pool itself. He had spent a great deal of money and time getting it just right, maintaining the perfect water chemistry, ensuring it was clean and inviting. But now he needed to make it look completely unusable. Alex had some basic knowledge of pool care, having looked after pools in his previous homes, but he knew that to pull off his plan, he would need to get creative. Alex spent the next couple of days researching pool chemicals, looking up everything from chlorine levels to stabilizers. He wanted something that would cloud the water and make it appear dangerous to anyone unfamiliar with pool maintenance. He found what he was looking for in a process called superchlorination, a technique used by pool professionals to sanitize water after a heavy influx of contaminants. By dramatically increasing the chlorine levels in the pool, the water would become murky and uninviting, even giving off a faint chemical smell that would be off-putting to anyone hoping to swim. But that wasn't enough. Alex needed more than just cloudy water. He needed something that would make the pool look as if it was hazardous. That's when he came across a product used in some themed pool parties. A foam agent that, when mixed with the chemicals in the water, created large fluffy bubbles. The foaming agent was harmless to the pool's surface, but when added to the water in large quantities, it would create a thick foam that covered the entire pool, making it look like an unholy mess of chemical disaster. Alex could already picture it. The foam would spill over the sides of the pool, leaving a strange, unsettling sight that would drive anyone away. The more Alex thought about it, the more he realized this would be the perfect way to assert his boundaries. He wasn't looking to hurt anyone, but he needed to make it clear that his space wasn't for public use. It was an unconventional move, but it was the only one left to him. With a plan in mind, Alex set to work. He bought all the necessary chemicals, large quantities of chlorine granules and the foam agent. He also bought a testing kit to ensure the chemical levels didn't get too out of hand. Alex was meticulous, measuring and mixing the chemicals with care. He even ran a few tests in a bucket to make sure the foam would have the desired effect without damaging the pool's surface. That Saturday afternoon, when the weather was perfect and the neighborhood was at its peak of activity, Alex knew it was time to put his plan into action. He had no idea how the Jenkins family would respond, but he was past the point of caring. He needed them to understand, really understand, that his pool, his yard, and his boundaries were non-negotiable. As the afternoon sun beat down on his backyard, Alex gathered the supplies he had spent the week preparing. He filled a small bucket with the chlorine granules, mixing it carefully into the water. The chemical reaction started almost immediately, the water bubbling slightly as the chlorine dissolved. Alex watched with satisfaction as the water began to turn a faint shade of murky green. He then added the foam agent, pouring it slowly into the pool. Within moments, the pool's surface was covered with a thick, foamy layer, the white bubbles spilling over the sides and creating a chaotic scene that was anything but inviting. Standing on the edge of his yard, Alex admired the spectacle. The once clear water had transformed into a cloudy, bubbling mess, and the chemical smell lingered in the air. It was dramatic, unsettling, and, most importantly, it would send a message. The final touch was to leave the pool to do its work. Alex made sure the foam stayed thick and spread across the surface, creating the illusion of a disaster waiting to happen. He knew that anyone who came across this site would quickly turn away, convinced that the pool was no longer usable. Then he waited. It didn't take long for Alex's neighbors to notice the change. As he sat on his porch, quietly watching, he saw a few of the Jenkins kids walking past his house. They stopped short when they saw the mess in the pool, their eyes widening in surprise and confusion. A few moments later, Paul Jenkins appeared, his eyes narrowing as he took in the sight of the frothy disaster that had once been a sparkling, inviting pool. "Alex," Paul called, his voice tinged with disbelief. "What the hell happened to your pool?" Alex stood up slowly, making his way to the fence that separated their yards. He met Paul's gaze, his expression calm but firm. "I think it's pretty obvious what happened," Alex said, his voice steady. "You and your kids have been using my pool without asking. I've asked politely before, but this is the result when people can't respect boundaries." Paul's face twisted in confusion. "This is over the pool? You can't be serious." "I'm dead serious, Paul," Alex replied, his voice hardening. "I've asked for respect. I've asked for privacy. You and your kids ignored me, so now you've got your answer." Paul blinked, clearly processing the situation. His eyes flickered back to the pool, then to Alex. "Look, I didn't know it meant that much to you. I'm sorry. We didn't mean to overstep." His voice trailed off, the playful arrogance that usually characterized his demeanor absent for once. "You should have respected my space from the start," Alex replied, his tone even. "I don't want to hear excuses. This is my home, my property. Don't make me do this again." Paul stood there for a moment, clearly taken aback. The sight of the foamy pool had clearly rattled him more than Alex expected. He didn't say anything further but nodded in acknowledgement. As Paul turned to walk away, Alex felt a strange sense of satisfaction. This wasn't the solution he had hoped for, but it was the one that had worked. The message was clear now. His space was his own, and anyone who ignored that would face the consequences. It wasn't the peaceful resolution Alex had wanted, but it was the beginning of something important. The Jenkins family had learned, in the most dramatic way possible, that Alex's boundaries were not to be ignored. And for the first time in weeks, Alex felt like he had regained control of his life and his space. The pool may have been in chaos, but for him, it was a small victory in a battle he had to fight. After Alex Kingston's drastic act of making his pool an uninviting mess, the consequences were swift and far-reaching. At first, he felt a sense of satisfaction in having taken control, sending a message to the Jenkins family that their disregard for his privacy would not be tolerated. But as the days passed, the tension in the neighborhood grew palpable. Alex had hoped for a quick resolution, but what he hadn't fully anticipated was how his actions would ripple through the community, creating a divide that was harder to repair than he had imagined. The very first indication that things had gone too far came the morning after the foam-filled disaster. Paul Jenkins appeared at Alex's front door, his face red with anger, his posture stiff with indignation. The casual, laid-back neighbor Alex had known before had vanished, replaced by someone more defensive and combative. "Alex," Paul began, his voice tight, "what the hell did you do to that pool? You've gone way too far with this." His hands were clenched at his sides, his eyes narrowed as he glared at Alex. Alex didn't flinch, though the tension between them felt thick in the air. "I think you know exactly what I did," he replied, his tone calm but resolute. "I've asked you and your kids repeatedly not to use my pool without permission. This was the only way to make you understand how serious I am." Paul's face twisted with a mixture of disbelief and frustration. "This is how you get back at us? You make your pool look like some sort of toxic mess? What were you thinking?" "I was thinking that maybe you'd finally respect my boundaries," Alex said, his voice steady. "I'm not asking for much, Paul. I just want my space to be respected." For a moment the two men stood in silence, neither willing to back down. Alex could see the tension simmering in Paul's eyes, the anger building as the reality of the situation set in. The Jenkins family was used to having their own way, and Alex's unexpected rebellion against their sense of entitlement had clearly shaken them to the core. Paul took a deep breath, visibly trying to contain his temper. "You're not going to get away with this, Alex. You think the whole neighborhood's going to back you up after this stunt? I doubt it." Alex stood firm. "I'm not looking for anyone's approval, Paul, but I will stand my ground." Paul scoffed, shaking his head in disbelief. "You're making this more difficult than it needs to be. You'll regret this." As Paul turned and stormed off, Alex could feel the sting of his words, though he wouldn't let it show. There was no turning back now. He had made his stand, and there was no way he was going to let the Jenkins family or anyone else walk all over him again. The aftermath of Alex's actions quickly spread throughout the neighborhood. The Jenkins family, once the life of the block, became a quiet, tense presence. The once vibrant gatherings and spontaneous gatherings around the Jenkins house now felt stilted and awkward. Paul didn't greet Alex in passing anymore, and Sarah, who had once been overly friendly, now barely acknowledged him when their paths crossed. The kids, too, seemed to avoid eye contact, their previously carefree chatter now stifled when Alex walked by. But while the tension between Alex and the Jenkins family escalated, something else was happening within the community that Alex hadn't expected, a shift in the way some of his other neighbors were starting to view him. At first, he had feared that his actions would make him the outcast of the block, the one who was considered difficult, even hostile. He was the new guy, the one who had caused a scene. But as the days wore on, Alex began to notice subtle changes in how his other neighbors treated him. One afternoon, as he was trimming the bushes along his front yard, Mrs. Watson, the elderly woman who lived across the street, crossed the road to speak with him. Her usual smile, warm and knowing, was accompanied by a nod of approval that surprised Alex. "You've got a point, Alex," she said, leaning slightly on her cane as she spoke. "People don't always realize how important it is to respect someone's privacy. You've been more patient than most would have been." Alex wasn't sure how to respond. He had expected to hear gossip or judgment, but instead Mrs. Watson's words were supportive. She wasn't the only one. A few days later, Tom and Linda Harris, the couple who had welcomed him so warmly when he first moved in, stopped by. Though Tom's expression was more guarded than usual, Linda had a gentle smile on her face. "We heard about what happened," she said, her tone neutral but not unkind. "And we wanted to check in on you. We know things can get complicated when it comes to neighbors, but I hope you're doing okay." "I'm fine," Alex replied, forcing a smile. "Just trying to make sure people understand where I'm coming from. I don't think it's too much to ask for some respect." Tom nodded in agreement. "We get it. We really do. It's not easy when you feel like people are taking advantage of you, but sometimes people don't realize the line they're crossing until it's too late." Linda, who had always been the more empathetic of the two, gave Alex a soft look. "We've had our own struggles with neighbors over the years, too. It's never easy, but you do what you have to do. Just don't let this mess with your peace of mind, okay?" Alex was surprised by their response. He had expected judgment, maybe even a cold shoulder from some of the neighbors. Instead, he found that his action, however extreme, had sparked a quiet sense of understanding. While there were still whispers among the more gossipy residents, the majority of people saw that Alex was simply standing up for himself, and that was something they could respect. Of course, not everyone was on his side. The Jenkins family made their displeasure known not just to Alex, but to others as well. A few days after their confrontation, Alex overheard Paul talking to one of the neighbors in the yard across the street. He couldn't make out every word, but the bitterness in Paul's voice was unmistakable. He was trying to turn the rest of the neighborhood against Alex, painting him as an unreasonable man who had gone too far. "That guy's got issues," Alex overheard Paul say, his voice low but clear. "No one should have to deal with a neighbor like that. He's making things uncomfortable for everyone." But Alex wasn't deterred. While the Jenkins family was trying to rally the neighborhood against him, there were others who were starting to recognize that Alex had simply been protecting himself. He wasn't out to start a war, but he wasn't going to be pushed around either. Slowly, a subtle shift began to occur. The feeling of tension in the air was still there, but it had started to fade into something more subdued. Neighbors who once greeted him with forced smiles or awkward silence now nodded as they passed. It wasn't overt, but it was enough to make Alex feel that, perhaps, he wasn't quite as alone in this as he thought. The real test came the following weekend. Alex had just returned from running errands when he noticed a group of neighbors gathered at the end of the street. They were all standing around in a circle, and at first, Alex thought it was just a typical chat between locals. But as he walked closer, he realized that Tom and Linda Harris were there, along with Mrs. Watson and a few others he hadn't yet met. And there in the center of the group was Paul Jenkins. The sight of Paul standing among the group made Alex tense up, his heart racing. But to his surprise, the conversation wasn't as hostile as he had feared. Paul was speaking with a forced but polite tone, his posture relaxed for the first time in weeks. "I just want to apologize to Alex for how things went down," Paul said, looking directly at Alex. His voice wasn't as angry as it had been before, but there was still a hint of unease. "I was out of line. I should have respected his boundaries from the start. And I hope we can move on from this." Alex blinked, surprised by the public apology. It wasn't a perfect resolution, but it was a start. Paul had been backed into a corner, but for the first time, he was acknowledging that maybe Alex wasn't the problem. The others in the group nodded, a few murmuring their agreement. Alex felt a strange sense of relief. The tension wasn't completely gone, but for the first time he felt like he had taken a stand. And, at least for now, it had worked. The neighborhood might never be the same, but he had earned the respect he needed to feel at peace in his own home again. As Alex walked back to his house, he couldn't help but feel a small sense of victory. The tension that had once been unbearable was beginning to ease, and he was no longer the outsider he had once feared he would be. He had made his point, loud and clear, and now, it seemed, people were starting to listen. After the dramatic fallout between Alex Kingston and the Jenkins family, the days that followed were marked by palpable tension. The neighborhood, once quiet and friendly, had become an uneasy battleground. The Jenkins family, accustomed to their vibrant and outgoing lifestyle, found themselves in a new and uncomfortable role, cast as the antagonists in a story they didn't quite understand. Paul Jenkins had been vocal in his frustration, trying to rally others against Alex, but the tide was slowly shifting. People were beginning to see the bigger picture, and, as Alex had hoped, his insistence on setting boundaries was not something the neighbors could ignore. In the weeks following the dramatic pool incident, Alex found himself more and more isolated. Though his relationship with many of the neighbors had started to thaw, the Jenkins family remained distant. Paul's initial hostility was evident every time their paths crossed. He would either avoid eye contact or mutter a quick, awkward greeting before retreating back into the relative comfort of his own yard. The kids, who had once waved at Alex in passing, now seemed to go out of their way to avoid him. The standoff between the two families felt like a Cold War. No words exchanged, just silent resentment building up in the background. However, not everyone was willing to let the rift fester. Sarah Jenkins, Paul's wife, was a woman who, despite her seemingly bubbly and outgoing demeanor, had always been the more thoughtful one in the family. It was Sarah who had been the first to speak up when Paul had made his usual dismissive comments about Alex and his pool. Over dinner, as Paul vented his frustrations about Alex's overreaction, Sarah had simply listened, her thoughts quiet behind her composed expression. She didn't fully agree with her husband's take on the situation. In fact, She couldn't ignore the growing realization that maybe they had been in the wrong. Sarah was the type of person who valued harmony, even if it meant swallowing her pride and admitting when she had made a mistake. As days passed, she couldn't shake the nagging feeling that Paul's attitude toward Alex had been harsh and uncalled for. She began to question whether their actions had escalated things unnecessarily. There was no denying that Alex had been a bit extreme in his response, but she also saw that he had repeatedly asked for respect. She realized that perhaps they had crossed a line, and Alex's actions, no matter how drastic, had been a reflection of that frustration. The realization hit her hard. Her husband's carefree and sometimes reckless behavior had dragged their family into a conflict with someone who, at the very least, was trying to assert his right to privacy. So, after weeks of internal conflict, Sarah decided it was time to make amends. She knew it wouldn't be easy, but she couldn't let this issue fester any longer. Alex deserved an apology, and more importantly, she believed the neighborhood deserved to heal. She had to swallow her pride and find a way to bridge the gap between them. One Saturday afternoon, when Alex was out in the yard trimming the hedge along the fence, Sarah walked across the street. She had debated whether this was the right time for days, but her decision had been made. She wasn't sure how Alex would react, but the thought of continuing the silent tension between their families felt like a weight she couldn't bear. When Alex saw her approach, he froze. He had gotten used to the cold shoulder from Paul and the awkward glances from the kids, but seeing Sarah walking towards him felt like a sign that things were about to shift. She was alone, her face serious, but there was a hint of something soft in her eyes that made Alex pause. "Hi, Alex," Sarah called, her voice tentative but warm. "Can we talk for a minute?" Alex wiped his hands on his pants and set down the trimmer, eyeing her carefully. He wasn't sure what this conversation was going to entail, but there was a part of him that wanted to believe that perhaps, just maybe, things could start to improve. "Sure," Alex said, standing up straighter as he crossed the yard to meet her at the gate. "What's on your mind?" Sarah took a deep breath, gathering her thoughts. "I've been thinking a lot about what happened between us, about everything that's been going on, and I feel like I need to say something." Alex raised an eyebrow, his arms crossed over his chest, but he remained silent. He wasn't sure where this was going, but he was willing to hear her out. "I know that Paul has a tendency to act without thinking sometimes," Sarah began, her voice laced with a mix of guilt and sincerity. "And I know he was quick to dismiss your boundaries. He was angry, and honestly, I think he didn't fully understand why this was such a big deal. But after everything that's happened, I can see that we were wrong." Alex was taken aback. He had never expected Sarah to come to him with such honesty. Paul had been the loud, outgoing one in the family, the one who had been so quick to blame Alex. But Sarah, with her softer approach, was offering something different. "I know I wasn't the best at stepping in and saying something when Paul was, well, when he was being too harsh," Sarah continued, her gaze steady but vulnerable. "But I realized that you weren't just protecting your property, you were protecting yourself, and I should have respected that from the beginning. We should have respected that." Alex felt a flicker of something stir inside him, a mix of surprise and relief. The anger he had felt in the past week slowly started to melt away. He hadn't expected an apology from the Jenkins family, let alone from Sarah. But here it was, coming from a place of genuine understanding. "I appreciate that," Alex said quietly, his tone softening. "I know it's not easy to admit when you're wrong, but honestly, the thing that upset me the most was how dismissive Paul was of my boundaries. It felt like no one was really listening." "I understand," Sarah replied, nodding, "and I'm truly sorry for how things have gone down. I can't speak for Paul, but I want you to know that I don't think what happened was okay. I've talked to him and we've discussed it. He's not happy about the situation, but I think he realizes that he needs to make things right." Alex could hear the sincerity in her voice, and for the first time in a long time he felt a small sense of hope. Maybe, just maybe, things could go back to some kind of normal, if that was even possible. "You're not the only one who's been affected," Sarah said after a brief pause. "The tension between our families has been hard on everyone. It's uncomfortable to walk past you or see Paul's face whenever he's upset. I don't want that for either of us." "I don't want that either," Alex replied, his voice calm. "I just wanted respect. That's all I've ever asked for." "Then let's start there," Sarah said with a small but hopeful smile. "I know it won't be easy, but I want to make things right. I want us to at least try and rebuild something, even if it's just being able to be civil with each other." Alex studied her for a moment, trying to gauge whether this was something he could believe in. It wasn't a complete resolution, but it was a start, and in the fragile state of his relationship with the Jenkins family, a start was something he hadn't thought he'd get. "I'm willing to try," Alex said, his tone cautious but open. "It's going to take time, but I'm not opposed to at least giving it a shot." Sarah's expression softened. "Thank you, Alex. I truly mean it." Over the next few weeks, Sarah and Paul began to make small efforts to rebuild their relationship with Alex. Paul, though reluctant at first, slowly began to soften his stance. He was still proud, still defensive, but there were moments when his facade cracked. Moments when he offered Alex a brief nod or even a small smile when their paths crossed. It wasn't a perfect reconciliation, but it was progress. Alex could see that the Jenkins family was trying to change. They weren't exactly the best of friends yet, but the constant tension and animosity had dissipated. The neighborhood, too, began to breathe easier. People no longer watched with bated breath, waiting for the next argument to break out. It seemed like, slowly but surely, Alex's stand had caused a shift, not just in his relationship with the Jenkins family, but in how the neighborhood viewed the importance of respecting each other's space. The healing was slow, but it was there, and for Alex, that was enough. After weeks of tension and uncertainty, Alex Kingston finally felt that it was time to take the next step in rebuilding his relationships with the neighbors. The previous incidents had left a mark on both him and the people around him, and though some had begun to warm to him, the unspoken discomfort lingered. The Jenkins family, while they had made efforts toward reconciliation, still carried a heaviness in their interactions with him. Alex, too, wasn't entirely at ease. His patience had been tested, and he wasn't ready to simply let bygones be bygones without some effort on his part to smooth things over. One evening, as Alex sat on his back porch, gazing out over the pool that had once felt like his personal refuge, a thought crossed his mind. He had spent so much time thinking about the boundaries he needed to set, the frustrations he felt, and the quiet solitude he craved. But what about building bridges? What about showing the neighborhood that he wasn't the difficult neighbor everyone might have assumed he was? The more he thought about it, the more he realized that maybe the best way to move forward was to take the initiative, not by retreating into the isolation he had grown comfortable with, but by extending an olive branch. He wasn't the kind of person who usually enjoyed hosting gatherings. The thought of playing the social host made him nervous, and the idea of large groups milling around his backyard wasn't exactly his idea of a good time. But things had reached a point where he knew he had to make a gesture. It wasn't just about being polite. It was about showing that he cared enough to mend the rift between him and his neighbors. So, after a long day of deliberation, Alex decided he would host a barbecue. It was a simple enough gesture, but he hoped it would be meaningful. The barbecue would serve as a chance for him to show that he wasn't just a man of complaints, but someone who valued community and was open to friendship. Someone who, despite the past tensions, was willing to start anew. The idea of inviting the Jenkins family to the event was one Alex wavered on for a while. It felt like a bold move, considering the rocky history between them, but deep down, he knew it was the right thing to do. If they were truly committed to moving forward, this could be the moment that helped bridge the final gap. He called Sarah first, nervously rehearsing his words before hitting dial. "Hey Sarah, it's Alex. I wanted to extend an invitation to you and your family. I'm hosting a BBQ this Saturday afternoon. Nothing too formal, just a casual get-together. I know things have been complicated between us, but I thought it might be a good opportunity for everyone to come together and move forward." The phone line was silent for a few seconds, and Alex held his breath, uncertain of how his invitation would be received. Finally, Sarah's voice came through, warm but cautious. "That sounds really nice, Alex. I think it's a great idea. I'll talk to Paul, but we'd love to come by." Alex let out a breath he didn't realize he was holding. The relief was immediate, though a part of him still felt nervous about the whole thing. He wanted to make sure it was the right environment, one where everyone could relax and enjoy themselves without the lingering tension. The day of the BBQ arrived, and Alex spent the morning preparing. He scrubbed the patio and rearranged the outdoor furniture, making sure everything looked just right. The grill was fired up, and he had prepared a simple but delicious menu: burgers, hot dogs, grilled vegetables, and his mother's famous potato salad, something that would remind him of easier times before all the drama had clouded his life. He even set up a cooler with drinks and a small playlist of classic summer tunes to set the mood. When the first guests arrived, it was a small, tentative wave of awkward introductions and polite smiles. The Harris family showed up first, followed by the Watsons from across the street. There were only a few neighbors at first, and Alex wasn't sure if everyone was there to simply avoid being rude or if they genuinely wanted to be a part of the event. But as the afternoon wore on, the atmosphere gradually lightened. Conversations started flowing more easily, and the tension from the past few weeks seemed to dissipate, even if only for the moment. As the smell of grilling food filled the air, Alex caught sight of the Jenkins family arriving, and his stomach did a small flip. Paul was standing at the edge of the driveway, his hands in his pockets, looking slightly uncomfortable, but he had that forced smile on his face, the same smile that had been missing during their last interactions. Behind him, Sarah gave Alex a small wave, and the kids, though still a bit hesitant, offered him polite greetings. "Hey Alex," Paul called, his voice slightly strained. "Thanks for inviting us. We weren't sure if we should come, but Sarah convinced me it was the right thing to do." Alex nodded, trying to keep the conversation light. "I'm glad you could make it, Paul. It's all about moving forward, right?" They both stood there for a moment, a little awkward, but neither of them flinched. Sarah stepped in, trying to bridge the silence. "We brought a salad," she said with a smile. "I hope that's okay. It's my mom's recipe, and I thought it'd be nice to share." Alex felt the atmosphere shift, the distance that had defined their interactions beginning to narrow. "Of course, that sounds great," he said, gesturing toward the table where the other neighbors had begun to gather. "I'm just glad you're here." As the guests filtered in and out of conversation, the barbecue seemed to take on a life of its own. Neighbors who had been tiptoeing around Alex out of discomfort or uncertainty now began to engage with him more freely. Mrs. Watson, who had been the first to offer him an encouraging word, sat down next to him with a plate of food and chatted about the changes in the neighborhood over the years. Tom and Linda Harris, who had also shown early support, made small talk with Sarah and Paul, and even Paul, who had been reserved at first, began to loosen up as the evening went on. The kids, who had been reluctant at first, were now scattered around the backyard, playing cornhole and chatting with one another. Emma Jenkins, who had once seemed nervous around Alex, offered him a smile as she passed by, a small but telling gesture that the ice had begun to melt. For Alex, the event was a turning point. Though the past couldn't be erased, the BBQ provided a glimpse of what could be, a future in which the tension between him and his neighbors was replaced by understanding and mutual respect. By the time the sun began to set, casting a warm glow over the backyard, Alex felt a sense of contentment he hadn't experienced in weeks. The neighborhood had begun to feel like more than just a place he had moved to. It was becoming a community again. As the evening wound down and guests started to say their goodbyes, Sarah approached Alex once more. This time there was no awkwardness, no tension. She reached out and offered her hand, her smile genuine. "Thank you, Alex," she said. "This was really nice. I think we all needed this." Alex shook her hand firmly, feeling the weight of the past few weeks lifting. "I'm just glad we could all come together. It feels right." "Yeah," Sarah replied softly, her eyes meeting his with a level of understanding. "It does." As the last of the guests trickled out, Alex stood in his backyard, watching the evening settle into peaceful quiet. He felt the weight of the past few weeks finally beginning to fade. There would still be work to do, rebuilding trust, mending old wounds, but for the first time in a long while, Alex felt hopeful. The neighborhood, once a place of isolation and frustration, was slowly becoming a place of belonging. He looked over at the pool, the setting sun casting a gentle reflection on its surface. It wasn't just the water that felt clear now. It was his relationship with his neighbors, his community. And as Alex stood there, a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth, he realized that this was the beginning of something better. After the barbecue, Alex Kingston could sense a change in the air. The event that had initially seemed like a necessary but uncomfortable gesture had in fact transformed into a turning point, not just in his relationship with the Jenkins family, but in his broader connection to the neighborhood. There had been a subtle shift in the dynamic, and it was becoming clearer that the walls of tension and suspicion that had once divided him from his neighbors were beginning to crumble. The barbecue, though a small gesture, had opened a door to something larger. A chance for Alex to truly feel like a part of this community, not just a stranger in the background. The days that followed were not without their challenges. It would take time for the damage of the past to completely fade, and Alex knew that there were still plenty of kinks to work out. The neighborhood had, in many ways, been shaped by the tension that had existed between him and the Jenkins family. Yet, Alex couldn't help but feel a sense of cautious optimism. The past few months had been hard, but the events of the barbecue had given him something he hadn't realized he was missing: hope. The Jenkins family's behavior had shifted as well. After the barbecue, they no longer treated Alex with the wariness they had before. It was as if the night of shared laughter and food had broken the invisible barrier between them, allowing for a more relaxed and open relationship to take root. Paul, once distant and occasionally brash, had started greeting Alex with a genuine nod when their paths crossed, and Sarah, always the more empathetic one, would offer a warm smile whenever she saw him. It wasn't as though they had become fast friends overnight, but the animosity that had once marked every interaction had been replaced with a sense of mutual respect. One afternoon, a few weeks after the BBQ, Alex was in his backyard, enjoying a quiet moment by the pool when he noticed Paul walking toward his gate. For a moment, Alex hesitated, wondering what this new interaction might bring. But Paul was holding a bag of groceries and wearing a casual smile, no hint of the confrontational energy that had been so present in their earlier meetings. "Hey, Alex," Paul called, stepping closer to the fence. "I was just picking up some stuff for dinner and I realized I had an extra bottle of wine. Thought you might want to join us for a drink tonight." Alex was taken aback. The offer was unexpected, and though it wasn't a grand gesture, it felt like a true olive branch. For a brief moment, Alex struggled with the urge to reject the offer. He had spent so much time keeping people at arm's length, unsure of how much he wanted to invest in building relationships again. But he knew this was an important step. If he was going to make progress, he couldn't shy away from the chance to connect. He had to embrace it. "That sounds great," Alex replied, his voice warm but cautious. "Thanks for thinking of me. What time?" Paul smiled, a genuine, unguarded smile that seemed to reflect the thaw in their relationship. "Around 6. I'll keep it casual, just the family, a couple of drinks, no pressure." Alex agreed, and as Paul walked away, he felt a sense of relief. The invitation wasn't just about sharing a bottle of wine, it was a symbol of something larger: the growing mutual understanding between the two families. As the evening approached, Alex found himself feeling a strange mixture of anticipation and uncertainty. He wasn't sure what to expect, but he knew that this small act of kindness could be the key to turning a page in his relationship with the Jenkins family. When he arrived at their house, he was greeted warmly by Sarah, who invited him in with a friendly wave. "You're just in time," she said, her voice cheerful. "Paul's already got the grill going and the kids are in the backyard. We're just keeping it low-key tonight, no fuss." The evening was comfortable and relaxed, far from the tension-filled conversations Alex had dreaded. The food was simple but delicious, and the conversation flowed easily. Paul, though still a little reserved, seemed more relaxed than before. The kids, who had been a source of awkwardness in the past, now played quietly in the background, occasionally running up to offer their 2 cents during the adult conversation. Emma, the younger of the two, even shyly complimented Alex on his backyard, a small gesture that spoke volumes about the change in their dynamic. As the night wore on, Alex found himself laughing and engaging in conversation without the lingering discomfort that had once defined his interactions with them. For the first time since moving to the neighborhood, he felt like he was part of something. Not just a neighbor to avoid, but a member of a community. There was still some distance between him and the Jenkins family, but it was no longer an uncomfortable gap. Instead, it felt like a space that was gradually closing, one conversation at a time. After dinner, Paul pulled out the wine he had mentioned earlier. The four of them, Paul, Sarah, Alex, and even the kids, sat around the table enjoying their drinks, talking about everything from local sports teams to home improvement projects. It wasn't deep conversation, but it was enough to make Alex feel like he was finally connecting with the people around him. It was these simple moments that he had been missing during his months of isolation, and they reminded him of why he had moved here in the first place, for a sense of belonging. As the night drew to a close, Paul offered one more small but meaningful gesture. "Alex, I know things have been rocky between us, but I appreciate you giving us a chance tonight," he said, his tone more genuine than it had ever been. "It's not always easy, but we're trying to make things right." Alex smiled, feeling the weight of the moment. "I appreciate that, Paul. It's good to finally have a chance to sit down and talk like this. I think we're all better off when we just talk things out, you know?" The conversation faded into easy, quiet laughter, and by the time Alex left, he felt a sense of calm that he hadn't felt in months. The night wasn't an instant solution to all of their issues, but it was a turning point. It was the beginning of something new, a step toward rebuilding not just his relationship with the Jenkins family, but also his place within the community. The following weeks saw more of the same. The Jenkins family, still respectful of Alex's boundaries, continued to make efforts to include him in their social circle. The kids were no longer the source of tension in the neighborhood. Instead, they were a sign of the slow healing taking place. Whenever Alex saw them playing outside, there was no longer the tension that had once made him feel uncomfortable. Instead, there was a sense of acceptance, a mutual understanding that had been lacking before. The other neighbors, too, began to warm to Alex. He found himself invited to small gatherings, like impromptu dinner parties or community meetings, and he started to recognize that he was no longer the outsider he had once been. People greeted him by name now, their smiles sincere rather than forced. When Alex took his evening walks, he no longer felt like the lone figure moving through a sea of unfamiliar faces. Instead, he found himself chatting with neighbors on their porches, engaging in small talk about everything from the weather to neighborhood events. It wasn't just about being polite, it was about genuine connection. The relationships were starting to feel real, and Alex, who had once feared he might never truly belong, was beginning to feel at home. He realized that building community wasn't about grand gestures or perfect solutions. It was about taking the time to listen, to engage, and to show up for one another, day after day. Over time, Alex's relationship with the Jenkins family continued to improve. They weren't best friends, but the respect between them was palpable. Their interactions became more natural, more relaxed. Even the occasional awkward moment was met with understanding and a shared smile, a sign that they had moved beyond their earlier discomfort. One evening, as Alex sat by his pool, reflecting on the journey he had been on, he realized that the neighborhood had become something he hadn't thought possible when he first moved in. It had gone from being a place of isolation to a space of connection, a place where he was no longer an outsider, but a member of a community that had accepted him, flaws and all. And just like that, Alex Kingston found peace. Not the kind of peace that comes from avoiding conflict or withdrawing from others, but the kind that comes from embracing the messiness of human connection, from facing challenges head-on and emerging stronger on the other side. It was a peace built on mutual respect, understanding, and the slow but steady work of building relationships that mattered. The neighborhood was no longer just a house he lived in, it was home. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a soft golden glow across the water of his pool, Alex Kingston sat at the edge, his feet dangling just above the surface. The sound of the gentle ripples lapping against the pool's edge seemed to echo the calm that had settled within him. He gazed into the clear water, his mind drifting back over the events that had brought him to this point. Not long ago, Alex's life had been consumed by tension, frustration, and a deep sense of isolation. The first few months after he moved into the quiet suburban neighborhood had felt like a battle. The Jenkins family, the neighbors who seemed to have no respect for his boundaries, had pushed him to the brink. His pool, once a symbol of peace and solitude, had become a battleground, a space invaded by those who thought they could treat his home as a public place. But now, as he sat by the same pool, Alex realized how far things had come since that initial clash. The anger that had once burned in him was now a distant memory. In its place was a quiet understanding, a sense of peace he hadn't expected. The last few weeks had been a slow journey toward reconciliation, not just with the Jenkins family, but with himself, and with the community he had initially thought he would never truly belong to. Alex had come to understand that life wasn't about avoiding conflict. It wasn't about building walls so high that no one could reach him. No, it was about finding balance, about standing up for himself when necessary, but also knowing when to open the door and let others in. It had been hard, the constant push and pull of asserting boundaries and finding common ground. But in the end, the reward had been worth it. His relationship with the Jenkins family, while not perfect, had evolved into something more respectful and understanding. There was no more tension when they crossed paths, no more uncomfortable silences when they exchanged pleasantries. It had taken time, but the respect they now showed him, especially in relation to his pool, was something Alex could finally appreciate. They had learned to give him space, and in return he had begun to see them not as adversaries, but as part of the neighborhood's fabric. But Alex's reflection went beyond just the Jenkins family. His entire perception of the neighborhood had shifted. The initial feelings of isolation and discomfort, those early days when he had felt like an outsider, had faded. He wasn't just living in a house anymore. He was part of a community. People waved at him on his walks, invited him to small gatherings, and he had even started engaging in conversations with neighbors he hadn't known before. There was a sense of connection now, a sense of belonging that he had longed for when he first made the move to the suburbs. The friendships that were starting to blossom were still in their infancy, but they felt real. It wasn't about big gestures, but the simple, everyday interactions that made Alex feel as though he had found his place. Mrs. Watson, who had once been a quiet figure across the street, now stopped by for casual chats over the fence. Tom and Linda Harris, who had initially been cordial, were becoming more like friends than just neighbors. Even the kids, the ones who had been so distant at first, were now starting to greet him with a smile and a wave, the awkwardness of their past interactions slowly dissipating. What struck Alex most was the change in himself. He had entered this neighborhood seeking peace, but what he had found was much more profound. It wasn't just the physical space of his home that mattered. It was the emotional space he had carved out for himself within this community. And that had required him to let go of some of the walls he had built over the years. Yes, it was hard to let people in after all the hurt he had experienced, but Alex had learned that true peace came not from solitude alone, but from finding a balance between self-respect and connection with others. Sitting there by the pool, Alex could see the transformation in his life more clearly than ever. The isolation that had plagued him after his divorce, the bitterness that had seeped into his daily routine, those things no longer defined him. Instead, he had rebuilt something new, a life that was both independent and interconnected, solitary but not alone. As the neighborhood settled into its usual evening calm, with the sounds of children's laughter from nearby yards and the soft murmur of conversations carried on the breeze, Alex realized how much he had grown. The quiet struggle he had gone through had taught him more than just how to protect his space. It had taught him how to find his place in the world again. He had stepped into a new chapter, one that was shaped by respect, understanding, and a slow but steady process of rebuilding relationship. And yet, there was still so much more to come. Alex wasn't naive enough to think everything was suddenly perfect. There would always be moments of tension, misunderstandings, and the occasional bump in the road. But for the first time in a long while, Alex felt ready to face whatever came next. He no longer feared conflict. He no longer saw it as an obstacle, but as an opportunity to grow, to learn, and to connect on a deeper level with the people around him. He thought back to the first day he had arrived in the neighborhood, how lonely he had felt, how unsure of his place in the world. But now, as he looked around at the familiar faces in the neighborhood, at the relationships that were slowly blossoming, he realized that he had found something he hadn't expected. A community that, while imperfect, was his. People who respected him, understood his need for space, and most importantly, were willing to accept him for who he was. Alex leaned back in his chair, letting the soft evening breeze wash over him. The worries of the past seemed like distant memories now, and the future, though still uncertain, felt full of promise. The battles had been fought, the boundaries had been set, and now he could finally relax, knowing that the chapter he had once feared would never be over was, in fact, just beginning. The neighborhood, his home, had become a place where Alex could breathe, where he could truly feel at peace, and that, he realized, was the beginning of something more meaningful than he had ever imagined. The story of Alex Kingston is more than just a tale of personal conflict and reconciliation. It's a reflection of the challenges we all face when trying to maintain our boundaries while navigating the complexities of community and human relationships. In today's world, it's easy to become isolated, especially when we feel like others don't respect our space, values, or needs. But Alex's journey shows us that true peace comes not only from asserting our boundaries, but from also being open to understanding and rebuilding connections with others. The deeper lesson here is the importance of communication, respect, and vulnerability. We often find ourselves in situations where we feel misunderstood, disrespected, or ignored. However, like Alex, we can choose to address these issues head-on, through open dialogue, patience, and a willingness to compromise. Sometimes reconciliation takes time, and it may require us to step out of our comfort zones. Whether that's reaching out to others or letting go of past grievances, the key is finding a balance between standing firm in our needs and allowing ourselves the space to build meaningful relationships. In today's society, where individualism and personal space are often prioritized, we sometimes forget that community and relationships are essential to our well-being. Our connections to others provide us with support, growth, and opportunities for change. And while it's important to protect our personal space, we must also recognize that our lives are interwoven with those around us. When we allow ourselves to heal and work through conflicts, we build stronger, more resilient communities. So here's the question for you. If you were in Alex's shoes, how would you handle a situation like this? Would you continue to protect your space and risk remaining isolated, or would you take a chance on rebuilding relationships and finding a sense of belonging? I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. Leave a comment below and share how you would approach such a situation. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more inspiring stories like this one. Thank you for taking the time to listen, and we hope to see you again soon.